My name is Rebecca and I am Professor of Archaeology here at St Andrews. And I am now going to answer your questions that you have been submitting for the last week about archaeology. Unfortunately, I won't have time to answer all the questions, but what I've done is looked at all the questions and tried to group some together to see if I can get as many answered as I possibly can. So, Lisa asked, how do old things end up being buried? And actually her question relates to questions that Rebecca, Hannah and Sam asked about burial processes and things like that, and also Karen. So, to answer this question, how do things wind up being buried? What archaeologists are working on is rubbish, essentially. So what we're studying is people's old rubbish, things that people threw away, blades, used pottery, like you see in the picture here, and stuff like that. That's what we're looking at in terms of archaeology. And that's the clue that gives us an insight into our past. And so how do things actually wind up there? Well, it's rubbish, so people throw them away and they get discarded. We can look at buildings too, and if you look at this photograph, you'll see that when buildings are abandoned or they've been destroyed, they, first of all, the first thing that usually happens to an abandoned or destroyed building is that the roof collapses in, and then weeds start to grow, things start to take over. And in this photograph, you can see that grass is even growing in the inside of the house. And then over time, the soil builds up over and over again. Now, in places like Greece, the soil buildup isn't very much because there's a high level of soil erosion. But in places like Britain, and in particular in Scotland, because there's so much rain, there's huge amounts of soil. So you have to dig really quite far in some places to be able to get down to the archaeology. Other reasons why things might wind up being buried are, for example, with actually burials themselves. So when a body is committed to the ground in a grave, that's a deliberate burial of that body. And Sam asked whether I'd excavated in cemeteries, excavated bodies, and the answer is yes, I actually have, lots of them. I've even excavated an individual who had been decapitated and then put in the grave. Burials are a fantastic source of evidence, and this is one of the questions that Rebecca asked. Source of evidence for how people lived in the past. So, for example, from a body that's been in the ground, as you can see from the photograph, we can tell a little bit about their diet, for example, from their teeth and from their bones. So, for example, if they're not eating enough fruit and vegetables, their bones will be able to tell us that. We can even tell their occupations sometimes. For example, if they're doing a repetitive job, that might wind up creating kind of muscle attachments onto the bone that then are shown up in the burial as well. So burials give us lots of information, also from the actual style of burial and about the grave goods too. They can tell us about what kind of religious practices people may have had and what kind of beliefs people had, and indeed lots about the community system too. Peter and Sophie asked me about how we can figure out how old an object is or how long it's been in the ground for. And there are lots of different ways of being able to do this. If the material that we're looking at is organic material, so for example wood, particularly burnt wood, or even things like hair from your head, or bits of other kind of material that will be grown naturally, therefore have carbon in it, so things like seeds as well, what we can do is date that material using a method called carbon-14 dating. And this is a scientific process where we would take our sample, say for example a soil sample which has seeds in it, and then send it away to a lab, and then they'll be able to give us a range of dates in which that material lies in terms of dating. But actually, we don't always have the opportunity to test organic material in this way. And so what we would rely on for all other kinds of material are things to do with stratigraphic dating. And now you can see I've got a stratigraphic image here And you can see that we're relying on relative dating in this respect, where the oldest layer is the layer at the bottom, and the most recent layer, as you can see from the image, is the layer at the top. Now, we can tell the different layers by how the soil feels. So, for example, if the soil is quite compact and really a different color, then we know it's a soil change and a different layer, and that will relate to a specific date. But that's all relative in terms of the soil layers. What you can see as well from the stratigraphic dating chart is that each layer will have different objects in it. And so, as I said, we know that the deepest layer will have the oldest objects in it, and what we now know for the most part is the date of things like pottery, and that's because there have been pottery sequences worked out from really as early as the 18th century onwards. And so people like Flinders Petrie, who you see here, he did huge amounts of work on working out the sequence of various different types of pottery that he found in Egypt. So you can see an image of that here. And other people in other parts of the world did similar things. So, for example, Arthur Evans did the same for the Minoans in Crete. So he worked out the pottery sequences for the Minoans within the island of Crete. And what that means is that if you find a piece of pottery in a particular layer and you know the date of that pottery, then you can date that layer, and you can also date anything else that's in the layer too, because they're all associated with the single context. In the same way, we can help date buildings through pottery, or again through carbon-14 if we have organic material. So, for example, if you find a foundation trench for a building and you have pottery in the foundation trench, then if you get a date for the pottery, then you'll be able to ultimately date the building as well. Jamie asked whether archaeologists have ever actually excavated museums. And the answer is yes, they have indeed. In fact, one of the earliest possible museums that's been excavated comes from Iraq. And the archaeologist Leonard Woolley in 1925 was excavating a Babylonian palace. And when he was this is an image of it here, and when he was excavating this Babylonian palace, he came across a room. And within the room, which dated to the 6th century BC, he found a whole range of different objects that didn't really seem to be part of this particular date. And when he further excavated, so he found bits of statue, bits of a boundary stone, and other things like that. But importantly, he also found lots and lots of little tiny tablets which had, in 3 different languages, and you can see them here, descriptions of different artifacts. And what they reckon was that the Babylonian princess Enegalbi, she collected this material from the local area and then put it in this room in fact, one of the earliest possible museums. Ewan asked, what, if anything, can archaeology do to help us fight climate change? And this is a really excellent question. And in fact, 2 of my colleagues in St Andrews, Andrea and Ruben, are working on precisely this. Andrea is, for example, taking cores from the Forum Boarium in Rome, and Ruben is using a combination of long-term landscape change and literary sources from the classical and later period, Hellenistic period, in order to be able to put this evidence together and tell us something about climate change. In terms of practicalities, what can archaeology tell us? Well, archaeology is really the study of society over a long period of time. And what we're looking at is how society changes or continues over that period of time. And what we can really see in the archaeological record is how people adapt to change. And so with things like environmental change, which we can see in the record, so for example, we can see when there's been lots and lots of crop failures, or we can see coastal erosion, we can see when there's been disease as well in the archaeological record. What we can then tell afterwards is how people adapt to these new circumstances. So the value of archaeology really is in the ability to see the kind of long event happening and to see how people adapt over time to the various different changes that they have to face as a result of environmental stresses. And so that's where we get the help. Because, you know, when we're living the climate change, it's not so easy to take ourselves out of it and see these big differences that are taking place. I hope you enjoyed these answers. If you'd like to know more about archaeology, do get in touch, because we could always try and arrange a school visit. Next week, we'll be answering your questions about finding bombs with bees and plastic. If you haven't already sent in your questions about finding bombs with bees and plastic, you can send them to this email here, or you can put them in the comments below by Friday, the 22nd of May. Thanks for watching.